data start becoming to be really big. So you mentioned about something about the FAA. So we decided to bring a lawyer, okay? And not only a lawyer, but he's also a pilot. And I think he's gonna give us some light, hopefully, or more confusion about what the FAA rules means and how we work with that. But just before he starts, his name is Bill O'Connor. We're so pleased to have Bill here with us. Drones, UAV or UAS, are to stay, you know. There's gonna be some amazing stuff happening in the future, and I think we need to embrace some of those things. So Bill.
Thank you, Gonzalo. It's really nice to be here. I've been practicing aviation law for almost 15 years. And my practice is shifting certainly because the firm that I'm with is one of the technology leading law firms, and we're starting to see a real proliferation of a new and exciting emerging technology, and so we're bringing together numerous resources to help tackle some of these problems. And it's certainly a very dynamic time to be dealing with the legal and regulatory aspects of unmanned vehicles. And that's not just limited to aerial application. That's a broader statement having to do with a whole set of issues having to do with unmanned vehicles. But aerial is a major issue, and it's certainly a hot topic right now, and it's a subject of discussion in a lot of different areas. And there's no question that overregulation can stifle innovation, and it can do a lot worse than that. That's a fundamental truth. We've seen that in a number of different industries over time. But I guess my message for today is there is hope. You can draw from a few examples from history. If you take the automobile, for example, my partner Chris Carr, who's in the audience, just published an op-ed this week in the Wall Street Journal that talked about some of the ridiculous regulations that were in place when automobiles first came online. For example, in Vermont, they had a rule that you had to have somebody walk 1/8 of a mile in front of your car to let all the pedestrians know that it was coming. In Iowa, you had to get on the phone and call each town along the way of your route to let them know that you'd be coming through. And a lot of other states have enacted speed limits that they were so low that your car could stall. You couldn't even drive. And we're seeing a lot of this today, and a lot of that is coming from the FAA. And keep in mind, this is an agency that is very, in its own mind, in many ways, mature. It's been around for over 50 years. They've dealt with a number of issues, a number of complex issues over the time. But I can say that unmanned aerial vehicles has completely disrupted what I call traditional aviation. And it will continue to disrupt what we view as traditional aviation. So where are we today? What does that mean as far as what are the rules in place for operating unmanned aircraft? Well, I can tell you what the FAA's perspective is. Their perspective is you can't operate an unmanned aircraft, and they do consider it an aircraft. And I was discussing with Steve before we got on stage. I mean, a lot of people don't agree with that because it's very different than manned aircraft, and we'll call it what we need to give us the most flexibility from a regulatory standpoint. But according to the FAA, it certainly considers unmanned aerial vehicles as aircraft. And from their perspective, you're not allowed to operate one without express permission. That is something that we could spend a lot of time talking about. Primarily, I think the overall message is that the FAA has exercised a lot of discretion not to bring enforcement against people who are being safe. So from a regulatory standpoint, where we are, there's a lot of gray areas. There's a lot of different arguments you can make about whether the FAA even has the authority. But one fundamental truth is if you don't want to worry about the FAA, just be safe at all times, and that's a good message. I'll give you a little bit of inside baseball. There is, if you go online, you can find the FAA. They publish everything. They have a form called their 2150 form. It's a checklist that their aviation safety inspectors will kind of tick through when they determine whether they're ever going to bring a violation against somebody for operating in the national airspace or some other regulated area in contravention of one of those regulations. It's really enlightening when you try to walk through that checklist and apply it to unmanned aircraft. It's almost impossible for them to get to the bottom of that checklist and get a green light to go forward. So check that out. That's the FAA's 2150 form. So that's where we are today. A lot of gray areas, a lot of disputes over what the FAA's authority is, but we've had some developments more recently where we can get a little bit of glimpse of where we think things are headed from a regulatory standpoint. In 2012, Congress, it was a reauthorization bill. They basically reauthorized the FAA's mandate, provided funding as part of that in a bill called the 2012 FAA Reauthorization Act. But part of that act included some specific instructions to the FAA to begin the process of integrating UAS into the national airspace. There's an overall component of that, Section 332, which provides for comprehensive integration of UAS into the national airspace. But they did have an interim statutory mandate to start immediately integrating certain safe operations in advance of this comprehensive rulemaking. And more recently, just a couple of weeks ago, the FAA took their first step towards that by proposing some rules for the initial step of integrating UAS operations in the national airspace. And they're fairly limited. And here's what they are proposing to do. They want to limit UAS operations to daytime. They want to keep UAS operations within visual line of sight of the operator. That means it has to be capable of being seen. There are some ways where you can use a visual observer. For example, if you have to fly behind an obstacle, you can have somebody standing where they can keep the UAS in their sight, but from the operator's perspective, the person actually flying the machine, they have to be capable of seeing the aircraft, and it has to stay under 500 feet, and they've created a new rating for UAS pilots. It's not as burdensome as if you were to obtain a pilot's license from the FAA. You don't have to obtain the typical 40 hours of flight experience. It's a much more simplified, less burdensome process. These rules are pretty similar to some of the exemptions that have been granted. There are people that are processing applications from the FAA to be able to operate sooner than when these regulations are going to go into effect. It's really unclear when these will become official. These are only proposed rules. It could be many months. We could have a first round of comments that are going to go in a couple of months. They could extend that deadline, the FAA, or they can even go back, make some changes to their proposed rules, and then put them out for comment again. So this is a real uncertain timeline in terms of when we'll get these. And again, these are just the first initial rules, but when we'll get them actually to be enforced and have the force of law. So what's next? The FAA, in their notice of proposed rulemaking of this first step, more limited set of guidelines, did leave the door open to more complex operations. John mentioned the concept of see and avoid. That's primarily what the FAA is most concerned about. They need to have, the aircraft need to have the ability to see each other in the air, and if it's autonomous or unmanned, it's really, they need to be able to sense each other in the air and avoid them. And until we have the technology gets to a point where it's more advanced, where it's capable of getting to see and avoid capability on these aircraft, and I think you'll see more complex operations being integrated and become part of the rules that will apply. This is what's going to happen under Section 332. You'll start to see some rules developed around autonomous operations. That there will be beyond line of sight operations, and sense and avoid technology is going to be a major part of that. So the 332 section authorization for more comprehensive regulations is probably going to leave some room for more complex operations. So how are we going to develop the technology where unmanned aircraft can have the capability to sense and avoid each other in the air? Really, that is going to be part of a process where we have an air traffic management system for low altitude UAVs. This is something that is very well developed in commercial aviation through ground radar, and the FAA has developed their next generation navigation, which is basically an ADS-B or a GPS-based highways in the sky. You're going to start to see that technology deployed at lower altitudes. UAVs are going to be able to communicate with each other. Aircraft that are flying at 30,000 feet have that capability, and they have that capability for a while now. You're going to, as soon as that gets miniaturized, the sense and avoid technology, the capability will be incorporated within unmanned aircraft, and then you can start building out the infrastructure. So how's that going to be done? This is a photograph that I borrowed from NASA. They're taking a real step forward in trying to bring together the private sector, government know-how, the FAA, NASA's expertise to start thinking about how we're going to build these highways in the sky. Whether it's going to be NASA who's going to run the traffic management system, whether it's going to be some private entity, whether it's going to be the FAA, how it's going to come to be is still being worked on. But in theory, we're going to have an infrastructure to enable and safely manage widespread use of low-altitude UAS operations. And it's going to consist of airspace design, and that's just sort of designating where the highways are going to be, what the corridors are going to be, dynamic geofencing, meaning where can you keep unmanned aircraft out of within the confines of these corridors and airspace design. What are we going to do about weather? There needs to be something in place that can predict, certain weather conditions where we don't want unmanned aircraft flying, route planning, and separation management. And the idea would be that it would not require continuous human monitoring of every UAS. You could have autonomous UAS operations within a traffic management system. And of course, it has to be extremely reliable. It has to be no downtime. But these are things that people are looking at in the future. And I think that the rulemaking process from a regulatory standpoint will try to adapt to what people are looking for as far as a traffic management system. Two types that are really being developed. One is the portable system. That can be deployed if you need to do search and rescue, for example, or if you have some sort of disaster operation where you're going to have a lot of unmanned aircraft because they're tremendously beneficial in that situation flying. You can deploy that traffic management system just about any geographic location and operate it, and then a persistent traffic management system, which would be the more established highways and corridors where the aircraft will operate at low altitudes. And again, just bringing it back to where we are on the regulatory side, we have an incremental approach that's being adopted. The slide I mentioned earlier seems very, very limiting. Yes, but it's not the end of the story. We're going to be seeing a lot of development for more technologically enhanced and capable unmanned aircraft, and I'm fairly confident that the regulatory regime will adapt to it.